The soldiers were close enough that David could hear the scrape of iron against rock. He pressed his back into the damp, uneven stone of the cave wall, forcing his breath to stay shallow. Outside, the canyon echoed with the rhythmic tramp of boots and the sharp, metallic clatter of weapons. He was cornered. There was nowhere left to run. He felt the cold condensation of the cavern dripping onto his hands, but his focus snapped to the wooden frame of the harp resting against his knees. His knuckles were white with the grip. He could wait in the suffocating silence, or he could act. He chose the latter. He reached out, his fingers finding the familiar tension of the strings. He did not play of his fear, nor did he hum of the encroaching blades. Instead, he pulled a single, resonant note from the instrument that spoke of the morning sun. He began to sing. His voice was low at first, a vibration against the stone. Then it climbed, steady and clear. It was a defiance of the hunt, a melody of light rising from the deepest, darkest hollow of the earth. The soldiers paused, the sound of their searching suddenly stalling in the face of the unexpected song. The heavy boots stopped their rhythmic pacing. Outside the cave, the soldiers fell silent, caught off guard by the melody drifting through the cracks in the canyon walls. David did not stop. He sang of the God who remained his refuge when the world felt as though it were crumbling into the sea. This was not a song of ease or courtly performance. It was the raw, unfiltered honesty of the second book of Psalms. These verses were never intended for the gilded halls of a palace. They were hammered out on the anvil of human struggle, forged in the heat of isolation and the cold bite of the wilderness. They were born where hope is tested, where the soul is laid bare under the crushing weight of reality. The listener hears the grit of the earth and the strain of a man who has lost everything but his faith. This collection does not gloss over the jagged edges of existence. It embraces them. It captures the frantic heartbeat of a fugitive and the desperate cry of a survivor. Every string plucked and every word sung serves as a testament to a faith that persists even when the shadows grow long and the path forward is entirely obscured by the hunt. The melody shifted, mirroring the interior landscape of a soul pushed to its absolute limit. Like a deer trapped in a forest, turned to ash, gasping for a hidden stream that refused to appear, the song became a desperate, rhythmic plea for water. The dry heat of the canyon mirrored the drought of the spirit. David and the sons of Korah poured their collective exhaustion into the air, their voices rising as a singular, urgent prayer. There was no pretense here. They did not mask the cracking of their resolve or the hollow ache of their isolation. They reached out for the one source that could satisfy an internal thirst which no human comfort could touch. It was a total surrender of the self, an admission that their own strength had evaporated like dew in the morning sun. Every note served as a vessel for this longing, carrying the weight of a heart that understood its own fragility. They were not merely asking for relief. They were declaring that without the presence of the Almighty, the soul would simply wither away. This was the core of their devotion, the recognition that life itself was found only in the fountain of His grace. And they were, in every sense, utterly dependent on the hand that governed the rain and the earth alike. The harp fell silent. David lowered his head, the wood of the instrument pressing against his chest as he sank to his knees on the jagged cave floor. The transition from song to stillness was absolute. He did not look for a way to justify his actions or shift the burden of his guilt. He knelt in the dark, his hands gripping the cold stone until his knuckles turned pale. This was the moment where the kingly armor vanished, leaving only the man. He laid his failure bare. There were no rehearsed speeches, no attempts to minimize the gravity of his sin. He breathed out a single, jagged plea for a clean heart, acknowledging that the outward display of power meant nothing if the core remained fractured. He understood that the Creator saw past every performative gesture, looking directly into the depth of his intent. His breathing slowed as he stopped fighting the truth. He offered his broken spirit, not as a final defeat, but as a sacrifice of radical honesty. He recognized the distance between his actions and the standard of the Almighty, and he refused to hide in the shadows of his own making. In the quiet of the cave, he faced the wreckage of his choices, waiting for a restoration that he knew he could never earn, but only receive. David stood slowly, his joints stiff from the damp chill of the cave. the heavy silence of his confession began to lift, replaced by a widening focus that reached far beyond his own fractured life. He looked toward the cave entrance, where the faint light of day hinted at the world outside. His thoughts moved from the inward wreckage of his own soul to the state of the nation. He began to perceive a pattern in the divine character that transcended his personal failures. This was no longer just a private dialogue. It was the recognition of a sovereign nature that reached out to the margins of society. He saw a God who stood as the father to the fatherless, a presence that filled the void left by human loss. He envisioned the shield of the widow, a tangible protection for those left defenseless by the chaos of history. The perspective shifted from the depths of individual repentance to the heights of national care. The God he worshipped was not merely a judge of his actions, but the guardian of the vulnerable. This insight brought a change in his posture. He was no longer a man hiding in the dark, but a witness to a divine justice that promised to shelter the broken people of the land. The rhythm of his thoughts began to accelerate. The steady, mournful pace of the cave prayers gave way to a pulse of something sharper, more urgent. David sat on a ledge, his fingers tracing the worn wood of his harp, feeling the vibration of a new melody taking hold. The cave walls seemed to recede as his mind reached forward, propelled by a vision that refused to stay within the boundaries of his present struggle. He was no longer just a man crying out from a place of hiding. The atmosphere inside the cavern changed. The damp air felt charged with a different weight. He sensed a transition, a turning point where the cries of the past were being eclipsed by the promise of what was to come. His eyes fixed on the horizon beyond the canyon, even though he could not see it. He began to anticipate a reign that would redefine the very meaning of power. The focus of his heart moved from the immediate need for protection to the grand, looming image of a future king. This was not a memory of what had been, but a pull toward a sovereign destiny that would eventually reshape the entire nation. He breathed deeply, steadying his pulse, as the anticipation of this grand vision filled the silence of the cave. David stood up, the stone beneath his feet feeling less like a prison and more like a platform. He began to sing, and the words were no longer contained by the narrow walls of the cave. Psalm 72 surged through him, a vision that leaped over the mountains of Israel to reach every corner of the earth. He sang of a reign that would not be measured by borders, but by the extent of its mercy. The vision was absolute. He described a king whose justice would flow like a river, reaching the distant islands and the furthest deserts. Every nation, every tribe, and every tongue would bow to a rule defined by righteousness rather than force. The stakes of this song were immense. It was a blueprint for a world made whole. He moved his hands as if weaving the very fabric of this future kingdom into the air. No longer was he the hunted man in the shadows. He was the herald of a peace that would outlast the sun and the moon. The cave felt small, almost insignificant, against the scale of the promise he was declaring. He sang of a world where the oppressor would cease and the humble would flourish under a scepter of grace. The air grew heavy with the weight of this majestic future, and for a moment, the world outside the cave seemed to bow in anticipation of that coming dawn. The vision of the future king held firm, but David needed to ground it in the reality of his own survival. He knelt, his hands gripping the cold, unyielding rock of the cave floor. He stopped looking at the horizon and looked inward, toward the source of his stability. In the center of the mounting danger, he declared the truth that made all other terrors seem small. God was not a distant idea. He was the ever-present help in the middle of the fire. David spoke aloud, his voice echoing against the damp stone, calling out to the ruler of every battle. He saw the soldiers outside. He heard their shouts, but they were now peripheral, shadows moving against a screen. The true power was not in the swords of his enemies, but in the hand that held the very structure of the earth. This was his anchor. Whether the mountains crumbled or the seas raged, the sovereignty of the Almighty remained the only fixed point in a shifting world. He felt the tension in his shoulders finally break, replaced by the weight of absolute certainty. God was the shield, the fortress, and the keeper of the covenant that no human army could break. He was the sovereign ruler, and in that singular fact, David found a security that the darkness of the cave could never extinguish. The echoes of his own voice died away, leaving only the soft drip of water against stone. David laid the harp aside. The wood was warm under his palms, a contrast to the biting cold of the cave floor. He sat back, his back against the rough, damp wall, and let his hands fall open in his lap. The urgency of the hunt, the rhythm of his own pulse, and the weight of the coming kingdom all seemed to recede into the shadows. He did not move. He simply breathed, matching the slow, rhythmic pace of the cave itself. This was the stillness he had sought, a quiet space where the noise of the world could no longer intrude. He looked at the dim light filtering through the entrance, realizing that even the stars he could not see were held by the same hand that sustained his breath. The tension in his chest dissipated, replaced by a clarity that felt heavier and more real than any sword. He understood then that the love he had found was not a reward for his struggles, but the very foundation of his existence. It was deeper than the ache of his bones, more enduring than the threats of his enemies, and far better than the life he was fighting to keep. He closed his eyes, resting entirely in that silence, anchored by a peace that required no further words. The stillness in the cave did not fade as the light shifted toward evening. David remained motionless, his fingers tracing the grain of the wood where his harp rested. He had walked through 30 psalms of struggle, of plea, and of praise, and the path behind him was now clear. He was no longer the man who had entered the darkness looking for an exit. He was the man who had found his center. The shadows of the canyon walls outside no longer held the weight of threat. They were merely part of the landscape he moved through, governed by the same hand that held the stars. He rose to his feet, his joints stiff from the hours on the stone, and stepped toward the cave opening. The air outside was cooling, carrying the scent of dry earth and coming rain. Every season of his life, the flight, the hunger, the battles, and the quiet hours was now marked by an unshakable confidence. He knew the path forward would hold its own trials, but the foundation was set. He walked out into the twilight, leaving the cave behind, his stride steady. He carried no illusions, only the absolute knowledge of a faithfulness that had outlasted every night. The journey was complete, anchored in the reality of an eternal promise that remained constant, regardless of the shifting seasons of the world.